What's going on, everyone? So today we're talking top 4 best / favorite decks from set 3 led by set 3 leaders. When we're looking at the meta for future tournaments and such from set 3, I'm 100% sure that we are going to see some Boba Fett's. We're going to see some Sabines. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw Rey's, Kira's, kind of the classics that we have been seeing, as set 3 hasn't really shaped up to really change that much of those set 1 or set 2 decks. There are some significant changes in some of them, and then in others, it's kind of just still really good. But in terms of what I've been testing out of the set 3 leaders, these are the top 4 that if you're looking for a deck from set 3 that's actually led by a set 3 leader, well, these ones are going to be for you. And I actually do think they have some potential to become some of the meta contenders. Before we actually talk about these lists today, and you can check them out in the links down below, big thank you to my patrons over on Patreon. We've been playing a ton of games, getting in all sorts of trouble. Not really, but lots of fun happening. And I also have a TCG player. Link in the description down below. Be sure to use it for all your Star Wars Unlimited card needs. Let's talk about the first deck on the list. So the first one up is Anakin Red. And I actually think Anakin has a couple different options. This is just the one that I've had the most success with, but I think Anakin Yellow, with now there are 2 of them, is pretty interesting. Anakin Green with the ECL, kind of doing the same thing that Sabine's doing, but just having a little bit more of a mid-range focus with Anakin as your leader, are all pretty interesting. One of the big things about this deck is this Anakin ability really prevents some of the better turn 1 into turn 2 plays in the game. For example, if your opponent goes Battlefield Marine and they plan on putting a wing leader with experience on that Battlefield Marine, suddenly your Bo-Katans, your Sabines, your Ketsus, whatever it is, can actually just straight up trade with that unit without taking, well, more than 2 damage, because Anakin deals 2 damage to himself. Things like that make this early game kind of interesting in that you don't actually have to be this extreme aggressor, albeit he absolutely can. And I think that's what gives him a little bit more of an edge than you might expect. You build him as sort of like that Sabine Green type of strategy where you have a lot of early game rebel threats. Your Red 3s, your Sabine Wrens, your A-Wings, your Fleet Lieutenants, all of which pretty similar in terms of the package that you're running with, like Sabine. But you don't actually have to play the extremely aggressive routes because you have such a massive payoff in the later stages of the game with Anakin himself, as well as a couple units later on in the game. Such as Resolute, being a unit that you can actually play a little bit earlier than expected due to damage on your base, or Wild Rancor, or things like Aggression to give you a little bit more value throughout the game. And then of course, the biggest thing is Anakin himself. Now, he does end up dying to things that you would expect normal leaders to die to in terms of Wreckers or Podamrons or things like that. But if you ever get a situation where you could deploy this guy and your opponent doesn't have an immediate response, this thing will hit for 7 damage on the regular, and that is a massive chunk, which gives you that edge in the mid game. And I've actually found more success with this type of deck versus some of the other options that you have for defeating the more mid-range style or controlling style, such as like Boba Green, for example. I've really liked the fact that Anakin oftentimes just one-shots Boba Fett when he comes down. And if you don't have Anakin himself, things like Jesse or Saw Gerrera or Poe Dameron still one-shot Boba if he comes down. Another dynamic to this one that's really, really impressed me is, of course, we are playing double red, so you get the aggressions and things like that, but a new card in Twice the Pride. This card not only in some cases acts as a removal, for example, killing your Ketsus or whatever, the mercenary gunships, which can be relevant, not extremely, but can be relevant. The fact that you can play this on any unit entirely, and that is really, really powerful. Doesn't seem like it, but of course, the first thing people think about is putting it on Anakin and making him like a 12-powered unit, which again is not rare. There are a lot of situations where I'll play Anakin or deploy Anakin, put Twice the Pride on him, attack for 12, bravado, attack for another 12, and that's 24 damage, oftentimes like 21 because you overwhelm through something, into their base, which just ends the game 90% of the time. If not, then something's gone seriously wrong. But you can also put Twice the Pride on something like an A-Wing or an Anakin's Interceptor, and that is massive. Again, A-Wing, twice the pride on turn 2, suddenly is a smacking for 7 damage, and something that your opponent really needs to deal with. And because it just gives you 4 power in general, if your opponent tries to deal with it by unit combat, they oftentimes will just trade with it. So twice the pride kind of acts as this 4 and sometimes 8 or 12 damage burn option, which is really good against some decks. Okay. Of course, with some of the additions to this, or with this being in the video, we've added a couple sideboard options. Things like Chaos of War works really well against something like a Palpatine deck that's drawing a ton of cards. Confiscate just works exceptionally well against decks that are running the Darksabers and things like that, but any deck that's really running any sort of upgrades. Pillages gives you, again, that more mid-range angle that you're getting with Anakin as your leader, and things like Wild Rancor, Mace Windu, and Resolute. And then lastly, a couple copies of Heroic Sacrifice for the more aggressive, knowing your units are going to die type of strategy, so you just get in for as much damage as possible. It is really, really quite strong. And again, the thing that makes it really, really nice is not only being able to be on that aggressive side of things, but using this action to actually completely decimate some things that you otherwise would not have been able to, right? Things like Chilton just suddenly get one shot by a K2. Like, that is extremely powerful to be able to do. Next up, we got a list that you all have not seen from me on Force Table or anything like that, but that is Yoda Blue. Now, you all have seen how much I've talked about Yoda in general and what I think about the card and what I think about him as a leader. But what's interesting about this is it's not necessarily all about Yoda. It's the fact that we're playing double blue, and we've gotten more and more and more double blue cards to get something like Bendu to really do some major work. If we were playing Iron Blue in the first set, that's when the last time really people saw Bendu. And you know, you could play your takedowns, you could play your vigilances, and all of that was good stuff. But not only do we have takedowns and vigilances, we also have Rivals Fall. We also have things like Sugi, things like Fell the Dragon, things like Equalize, things like Zillow Beast, which now can come down the turn after you play Bendu. All of which really make this deck turn into an absolute powerhouse when Yoda comes down. The curve on this deck is absolutely absurd. In the earlier game, you're playing out some kind of random units with some Restore or Sentinel, or you're turn 1 playing like a Queel, Restore, or getting a little bit of damage, maybe restoring a little bit, maybe some drawing some cards. As soon as turn 2, you're playing things like Hello There and Equalize to really clean up the board. Turn 3s, you're playing things like Vigilances and Takedowns and Fell the Dragons, or things like Kanan and Sugi to kind of stall out the board. And then turn 4, you're doing the same thing, stalling out the board, getting some more removal down. As soon as Bendu comes down, assuming your opponent doesn't just get absolutely brick walled and mess up their whole strategy, if you're ever able to get a single attack in with this guy, which ends up being absolutely massive, the next turn you can play a Zillow Beast, which is really massive. And what's interesting about Zillow Beast is it allows for the rest of that turn to actually come into play, right? When you're playing Zillow Beast, you get that -5/-0, and you can really, really prevent a lot of damage from actually just rushing at your face, which allows you to get down Yoda, kill something, restore some damage, and then actually use the Zillow Beast to close out the game. But that's not all. If you do end up attacking with Bendu, you could do some crazy things, such as playing Vigilance, Queel, and Hello There on the same turn, or double Vigilance with the resource cost reduction on Bendu. You actually really start to feel the resource cost with Bendu, whereas other Sentinels such as Obi-Wan or even the Mandalorian sometimes don't actually give you all that much value, because the Mandalorian requires you to have that 2 resource play. The Obi-Wan requires you to have another unit in play, and sometimes control decks just don't necessarily do that all that often. And while Obi-Wan can be good, I've actually been really, really impressed with Bendu in this deck. Now, of course, we still have that same Yoda package where you're able to go ahead and kind of filter your hand, get some value going. Things like C-3PO work really well because of this. C-3PO, honestly, not necessarily in there to draw you a bunch of cards, but kind of just there as a body that's meant to kind of provide some disruption. But the whole name of the game is to heal up a lot, stall out the game, and then close out the game with things like Luke Skywalker, Obi-Wan, Bendu's, Zillo Beasts, etc., which I've been really, really excited about. In the sideboard, we've got a lot of options to deal with more aggro. We've got top targets, devotions, village protectors, takedowns, all of which to really, really hammer home the fact that we're not going to die to aggro in the early game. Getting down a devotion on something like a Concord Dawn Interceptors can completely finish off your opponent, just restoring to every single turn and preventing any sort of space units from getting in. Of course, we also have some other options, things like Obi-Wan's Ether Sprite to deal with a bunch of space units if that is something that people are doing, which some people are going all space in some of these games, and then also restock for some of the control mirrors. But overall, really enjoyed Yoda, and I really like this double blue version. The next one, probably to no one's surprise, is double yellow Asajj. This is the most exciting for me, and also the deck that was the most surprising for me. Now, there's a bunch of similarities to double yellow Boba, but for me, the thing that's more exciting about this list compared to double yellow Boba is it's really more focused on actually killing your opponent by turn 3 or turn 4. And it's very possible to do so, as you all saw in some of the games. A couple of things that really make that possible are the extra power on Petronaki Arena. Mind you, with Petronaki Arena and the additional damage from Asajj if you've played an event that turn, that is a 5-powered attacker similar to Kylo Ren, which really gives you just a sense of how strong that can be. Not to mention, you can also get in some early damage if you play early events. But on top of that, we get to play arguably the most powerful options in terms of 2-card combos in the game right now, which is now there are 2 of them plus some sort of thing that can set that up for turn 2. And Asajj is not the only one that can do this. Honestly, the 2-card combo is just now there are 2 of them, and then a strong 5-drop, to be honest. If you could ever play like Podameron or things like that, that would be awesome. But basically, any 5-resource play that you could play on turn 2 is just good, right? And in this deck, we have 6 of them. We've got Zuckuss and Boss getting turn 2. Zuckuss down is really, really crazy. And what's really cool about now there are 2 of them in this deck is because it's an event, it also works with all of Asajj's synergies. But you also get access to things like Cunning, things like Waylay that we already know are really good, and this sort of normal curve that you're used to in Boba Yellow. And you can absolutely curve out on your opponent without doing too much in terms of event usage. But in some cases, you can actually play a little bit more of a controlling route and absolutely destroy people with Asajj getting that first strike option, right? There are many games where I'll go turn 1 Separatist Commando, turn 2 some random 3-resource play like Bodhi, turn 4 I'm playing things like Surprise Strike to get in for a lot of damage while also flipping Asajj, while also, triggering her action on the front side, getting in for first strike damage. There's a lot of different things that you can do, and there's a lot of different angles this deck can attack on. In the sideboard, a little bit of an additional cards that we've added. One of the big things that I noticed when playing Asajj is something like Cad Bane. While very strong when he comes down, the games end very quickly in this deck. And if they don't, you're usually in a bad spot. But in some cases, Cad Bane can kind of allow you to recover. And so instead, we added more consistency to the now there are 2 of them, and a little bit more consistency to the overall event/curve by removing Cad Bane and relegating him to the sideboard. A couple of other cards to finish off play sets. Things like No Good to Me Dead and Waylay are really excellent in some aggro matchups. Lurking Tie Phantom gives you a really nice angle against some of the more controlling decks. And then one of the cards that I've been really impressed with, especially in a deck like Asajj, who's looking to make cheap plays, especially with events, disrupt your opponent and get in extra damage, Unmasking the Conspiracy. And against some decks that are relying on like takedown or passing to try to get your Asajj, Unmasking the Conspiracy can be an absolutely devastating play, and it's something that only costs a single resource, albeit for an additional card, which is not usually that big of a problem in this deck. Mind you, in order to play this type of strategy, when now there are 2 of them, you're going to want a lot of cards that are able to play your 5-resource play on turn 2. In this deck, honestly, it's a little bit light in 8 cards, giving you the option to play Bosk and Zuckuss, because Separatist Commando does not give you that option. So that's something to consider. But regardless, I've been really impressed with double yellow Asajj, and it's probably my favorite deck of the list. And lastly, we have definitely the most difficult, most heavy sequencing deck in the entire game, at least in my opinion, in Palpatine Blue. The new Palpatine, that is. Now, there are a lot of debates on whether or not Palpatine himself is a good deck when we get to the larger meta and everything like that. As far as my experience, I've had some good experiences with him, but it really, really requires you to get used to the deck, understand what you can play, understand how to sequence your plays, because I still mess up with that, even after I've played many, many games with this guy. And overall, a really, really powerful kind of combination of not only having really powerful heroism cards that finish off the game, but also the villainy cards that can finish off the game for you as a control player. And one thing that it's really important to note is oftentimes when you're playing these control decks, take Vader Blue, for example, back in set 1, most of the time, by the time you're deploying Vader, the game, in some cases, can be controlled by a Vader leader, but oftentimes you're just doing a good enough of controlling the board to where the Vader flip doesn't even matter. And that's something that I've really noticed is that while in some games, having a flip leader coming down early can really, really shift the game, Bosk Blue, for example. In other games, it's really, really nice to have this just passive value, something that your opponent constantly has to think about and constantly has to deal with. Now, this also, I think, is a symptom of some people not understanding Palpatine, as it is a very complicated deck. And so if you're able to have the knowledge above your opponent, and what I mean by that is they don't really understand how Palpatine works, so they don't know how to really control your flipping back and forth, well, you're going to have more advantage than you otherwise would have in other situations. But that doesn't mean that you can't still control your own flipping with Palpatine back and forth. And oftentimes just the random heals, the extra card draw, making Chilton guaranteed be a massive, massive threat, giving you more options to deal with all sorts of different things. And of course, at the end of the day, just being able to close out the game with a smattering of extremely powerful plays. Luke Skywalker being one of the best late game plays, sometimes better than Darth Vader in the heroism side of things that you can play alongside things like Snoke and Avenger, which are the best villainy game enders that we've seen realistically. But I think the biggest thing that people need to think about is this Chilton. This card in general has been a staple of control decks the entire time control decks have existed. And between Chilton and General Grievous, these overstated units that you could just get down, you actually have a really good chance of controlling the board through proactive measures, not just things like Takedown, Fell the Dragon, Vigilance, and things like that. In terms of sideboard, we got some more options for dealing with early game threats like Takedowns and Concord Dawn Interceptors. The 3 copies of Waylay, not exactly a card I'm extremely excited to play in the main deck because it doesn't actually have any sort of Vigilance or a heroism or villainy tag, but still a really nice tempo advantage that allows you to stall out the game a little bit more. And of course, Super Laser Blast and Vigilance. Super Laser Blast to actually deal with more mid-range strategies, and then Vigilance to give you a little bit more healing and such in late game power. Overall, I've been really impressed with this deck, especially considering it's a leader that doesn't actually have a flip to it, which is the biggest concern that I think everyone thought of when you saw Chancellor Palpatine. Now, I'm sure there's a ton of other decks out there that are going to have some competitive viability, and, you know, who knows? The meta will be completely different potentially from what I have been experiencing so far, and we could see a little bit of everything / maybe a little bit of nothing, and no more Sabine, no more Boba. Don't think that's going to happen, okay? Don't think that's going to happen, but you never know in terms of what people end up figuring out. These are just the decks that I not only have had good success with, but decks that are actually extremely fun, especially this double yellow Asajj deck. This is the deck I actually want to build in person the most. There is just something ridiculous about playing Zuckuss on turn 2 or Bosk on turn 2, and any deck that could do it makes me a happy, happy man. So thanks for watching, everyone. Let me know what your decks have kind of shaped up to be and whether or not you've had great success with them in the comment section down below. I'm sure there's a ton of other content creators talking about the decks that they've really had a good time with or a ton of fun with. Thanks for watching. I'll see you all for the next one.